How do you fix a broken race car when the manufacturer no longer exists, there's no spare parts and not even a manual? Well, you need to be resourceful and rely on help from your friends. As you can see, the car is not quite ready for the track again, but appearances can be deceiving and it's actually pretty close. True to the spirit of this channel, things are never that straightforward, so let's start with a little recap. A quick recap, and in my last video, I finally got the car on track after a year and a half, but it only lasted 1.5 laps before a mechanical failure ended my day and required the help of the marshals to roll me back to the pits. The superficial part was all of the grass from where my car became a lawnmower, but more concerningly, the reason for the off of snapped drive shaft on the right hand side. But it was also clear that the nose of the car was pointing to the side, with the fiberglass wing elements completely busted. So what exactly went wrong? Why did the drive shaft break a lap and a half in? It was actually viewer I Have Gum Gum who made an outstanding observation on that video. I had a brief amount of footage with the car in the pits before I went out, where I jacked up the rear so I could reacquaint myself with the gear shift system. And in that footage, it's clear to see that the drive shaft was already bent, and as the comment says, that's going to cause vibration and lead to a failure at one point or another. Considering it's the first time I've driven the car, that means it was already busted when I purchased it. And considering in an earlier video, I covered how I had purchased the car with some front wing damage that wasn't disclosed until I'd driven hours to pick up the car, I think it's safe to say that this car has had a bit of a checkered history and the seller hadn't told me all of the details. Before we continue, a huge thank you to Greg, owner of one of the sister cars. As I mentioned in the last video, he recently broke a drive shaft as well and was able to share a lot of information to make my life easier as well as some parts. Let's move on with the repairs. Before that shakedown drive, I had actually managed to get everything off my list. But of course, after the shakedown, there were new things to fix. Some of them were obvious, like the drive shaft, but there was a range of other niggles that I didn't discuss in the last video because they're not as important. For instance, there was a few things that needed attending on the trailer, and along with the bigger repairs, I've been slowly ticking these off. For instance, a bunch of the tyres for my stone guard on the trailer had worn out, snapped and needed replacement, which I did with cable ties. Actually, I only did a couple, and then I put my 11-year-old son in charge of the rest, which he really loved. The jockey wheel at the front of the trailer was starting to seize, so I purchased a replacement. This was a 10-minute fix, and I wish everything on this car was as easy to do. In an effort to get more things out of my car and onto the trailer, I've got these 2 jerry can holders. They haven't been fitted yet, but when I do, I'm also going to add some simple brackets to clamp this quick jack onto the drawbar as it takes up most of the tray of my ute. To power the winch, I was using this power bank, but it seemed to be slowly dying under the load. So I made up a simple extension cable that would reach back to the plug at the rear of my car. You also might remember that my car was lower than the barriers and therefore was required to have a flag strapped on. Last time that was done with a whole lot of tape. So I've designed and machined this simple alloy bracket. It bolts onto the camera mount and will have some 3D printed extensions to make it a bit stiffer and to get more grip on the flagpole. But that's enough low-hanging fruit, let's move on to the big ticket items. As far as I was concerned, that front wing was toast. I wasn't interested in getting a repair because the last time I tried to do that, I felt quite frankly ripped off. So back to Greg, owner of one of the sister cars, and as you can see, his front and rear wings and everything else have been modified for hill climb, and that means maximum downforce. But that means he had the original spare front wing assembly that came on the car before he switched over to his custom one. Fortunately for me, he was kind enough to send it my way, and he only wanted money for freight. He was willing to give it to me for free. So I still gave him a donation for his kindness, and a couple of weeks later, after a hiccup from the courier, I received a large package. Greg had taken great care with the packaging and the parts arrived undamaged. You'll see here that Greg actually had 2 front wings spare that he was kind enough to send me, and my first job was to get them reassembled. Using some photos plus my old wing as reference, it wasn't long until I had the 2 new wings together and I could compare them to my original one. The planes of my original wing were both fiberglass, and this came in at 6.5 kilos. The alternate version of this from Greg still used fiberglass for the upper plane, but instead used alloy for the lower plane. And because of this, despite being wider, it actually weighed 1.5 kilos lighter at 5 kilograms. The wing that's actually going on the car is this top one, which is completely made from carbon fiber. It's not the lightest one here, but it matches the original wing's weight of 6.5 kilograms. It's also similar in width to the broken one that was on the car. You might be wondering if it's actual carbon or just some sort of sticker, but you can tell that it's real by all of the imperfections. Greg said that this was custom made by the previous owner. The upper planes are adjustable and feature a little gurney flap. Each wing is compatible with the mounting brackets already on my nose cone, so if I want, I can very quickly switch between them. I really like how this front wing looks, although the mounting is a little bit crooked still, so I'll need to investigate and maybe make some minor modifications. What you're seeing here is a bit deceiving because the back of the car is jacked up, but this new wing seems to sit a little close to the ground at the front, especially compared to how it sits in this old photo. So again, some more adjustment might be needed. And obviously I need to pull off the vinyl on the end plates too. So once again, thank you to Greg. I've gone from having one busted front wing to having 3 in total, with the best one being an upgrade. The front wing was pretty painless thanks to Greg, but the drive shafts, even with his help, would prove to be trickier. The following is documentation of how to disassemble the rear end of the car, and it's for my benefit as much as anything. After removing the center nut, the whole wheel can come free, and then we have 2 large bolts that hold on the brake caliper. You can also see an alloy spacer between the caliper and the upright to get the correct spacing. With the caliper out of the way, the disc and hat can slide straight off, and we can start to remove the 3 bolts that secure the end of the suspension arms to the upright. Now just for fun, these were a mix of metric and imperial, and I needed to invest in some more tools. Assuming you have the CB boots free, that's all that's required to pull the uprights away from the car, including the drive shaft. With this out, I could finally get a proper look at the brake. Here's the 2 halves cleaned up and next to each other. And yes, where the brake was a groove where a circlip rides. The drive shaft had sheared off on the inside and was unattached from the car, but it was still attached to the outer CV on the back of the upright. And Greg once again did me a solid by sending me this picture showing there was a hidden circlip inside the outer CV that holds the drive shaft in place. I'm not gonna lie, my first attempts at doing this circlip didn't go very well. There was too much grease everywhere and I didn't really know what I was aiming for. But once you get it for the first time and you can see and understand exactly how it goes together, it becomes a lot easier to put it in or out from that point forward. The drive shafts were free, but I still had to get the outer CV out of the upright, and there's a bolt down the center to retain it, and normally this would be a lot easier to get undone if everything was still in the car and you could use the brakes. Again, as soon as you get this out, you instantly get your head around how it all goes back together. The inner CVs go into the diff, and there's a wire clip on the back of these that needs shock loading to compress and let them come free. Normally you would use a slide hammer, but I had to improvise as I didn't have one. Eventually, all of the parts were out and I could start to measure and compare notes with Greg. Firstly, the CVs that were a very close match to what Greg had measured on his. Close enough that it was probably just measurement inaccuracies accounting for any difference. And you can see a part number there, and no, it didn't equate to anything when searched. My drive shafts, however, were actually quite different from Greg's. For one, his were both the same length and used a spacer to allow this, whereas on my car, the right drive shaft that broke was clearly longer than the left-hand side. There was also differences in the surface texture and outer diameter too. Probably the most important thing, the splines matched what Greg had measured on his car. Now Greg once again had already done the hard yards by researching until he found some inner and outer CVs that seemed to be a match for what came in our cars. Not an exact match, but a close enough match that with a little bit of work they should fit right in. So I ordered 2 of each and waited anxiously. They came pretty quickly, and visually at least they seemed to be a nice match. We can see for the inner CVs that the cup is a little bit deeper on the new version on the left here. But most importantly, I checked the fitment with the splines, and although some parts were a little bit tight, I could get them on and off without the use of any tools. The outer CV splines were a little bit more forgiving, and the old shafts slid right in. But remember how I said they wouldn't be an exact match and needed some work? Well, here is the difference. The splines are the same, and the enclosed section is a little bit taller on the new version, but the main difference comes at the other end, where the old CVs have a bolt that goes into a bore, but the new ones have a shaft that is secured by a nut. So the new outer CVs needed to be machined to make this change. I packed up all the parts necessary to explain the work that needed doing, and went to visit Dave at CMP Engineering as recommended by Matt. And about 2.5 weeks later, I had the outer CVs machined and ready to go. As you can see, the bore was matched with a left-hand thread on one side as per the original, so that was one big hurdle eliminated. Now, I couldn't just pay someone to machine an exact copy of the old drive shafts. Things were a little bit more complicated than that. Alright, let's explain what needed to be done with a grossly simplified diagram. So obviously we have the car, and what you're about to see is definitely not to scale. Plugging into the diff on either side are our inner CVs, and then plugging into the uprights on the outsides are the outer CVs. And then linking the two are the drive shafts, one of which on the right was broken, so I needed a replacement made, and I wanted a spare for each side as well. But here's where it gets complicated. From the mating surface, the inner CVs have a different depth, but on this side at least, it's mainly just the cup. The outer CVs also have different dimensions relative to the flat mating surface, but here it's not so superficial. The part where the drive shaft locks in sits further out on the new version. Plus, the old outer CVs have that little circlip to retain the drive shaft, whereas the new ones don't, and will need a combination of regular circlips and those sprung wire clips on the inside. So ideally, I would be getting a drive shaft machined that was the correct length with the correct circlip slots to fit both the old and new CVs for either side. This is a lot of permutations to consider, so I made the decision to simplify things by abandoning the old inner CVs. Each of them looked a little worse for wear, with a fair amount of scoring on the input shaft. To get the rest of the design right, I designed these 3D printed versions of a drive shaft, and printing them in several parts to avoid the need for support. For the outer spline, they have enough circlip grooves to allow them to fit both the new and old outer CVs. And my aim was to get new and old to sit as close in height as possible. Here's another crude diagram to show the diff on the left and the upright and wheel on the right, and you can see that the tip of the drive shaft moves in and out at the center when the suspension goes through its range of travel. Because of this, the tripod on the inner CV is fixed in place, but that tripod is free to move in and out to prevent binding inside the inner CV cup. So I needed to find the perfect length for the new drive shaft, and if I disconnect the push rod, the suspension can move freely up and down. I can then check that the tripod is not bottoming out on the inner CV and change the length of the drive shaft using the threaded rod if necessary. This part was time consuming and needed a lot of iteration. I generally started with the original drive shaft with old outer CVs and new inner CVs to make sure there was sufficient clearance. I would then set the adjustable drive shaft to the same length, fit the new outer CV, and take it through the range of motion once more. I also kept track of the depth the tripod was roughly sitting inside the cup. For the broken right drive shaft, I taped everything together and it was surprisingly robust. Certainly strong enough to last a few seconds to make sure I had enough clearance. And of course, the last combination that I tried bottomed out at the top of the suspension movement, so I had to redesign, reprint, reassemble, and test a few times to get that perfect. I don't know how I would have tested all of this without access to 3D printing. And this is what I end up with, ready to take to an engineering place. They may want me to adjust things a little, but as far as I know, assuming they have the old shaft and CVs, they can accurately measure the splines and then use this drawing to get the total lengths, the spline lengths, and the circlip grooves machined. So hopefully the new drive shafts won't take very long, and I've got a few other little items to cross off in the meantime. A huge thank you to Greg once again. Having him as a resource is an example of how helpful it's been to document everything and create this channel. I know what you're thinking, Michael, you're just having a midlife crisis, but no. My whole life I've been modifying and tinkering with cars and loved motorsport. It was just a matter of biding my time until I was old enough to be considered a gentleman racer.